Can everybody hear me? Is that my mic on? Okay. Good evening, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, and I imagine that's everybody except for my mom and dad, my name is Kinsella and I write for JOE.ie. Before I start, I want to thank everybody for being here, and I'd like to pay a special thanks to my fellow guests, Philly, Brezzy, Blind Boy, Kat, and Brian. And lastly, I'd like to thank JOE.ie for asking me to lend my voice to such an important discussion. So, I've suffered from anxiety problems pretty much my whole life long. And a big part of that is feeling very inadequate to fulfill the roles I've been asked to fulfill. So I really mean it when I say special thanks to JOE.ie for putting me in a position where I'm reminded I'm not as handsome as Brezzy, I'm not as funny as Blind Boy, I'm not as strong as Cat O'Brien, I'm not as good at sport, as Philly McMahon, I'm not as wise as Brian Higgins. So thank you again, Paddy McKenna. But in all seriousness, those 5 people, they have invaluable wisdom and an inexhaustible will for this cause. And I believe their passion is reflected in the attitudes of so many Irish people at the moment. As Brian said, 130,000 people turned out for Darkness into Light last weekend. In 2009, that was 200 people. Roughly this time last year, I wrote a piece and it was called 7 Reasons Why Anxiety is a Lot Like North Korea. And it got virtually no interaction online. Very few people clicked it, very few people read it. And nowadays, the average JOE.ie reader says that the most pressing issue of our time is mental health. So the Irish people know that it's time for action. And the Irish people are ready to take action, and I think that's why we're all here. So as for my own mental health credentials, as it were, I'm a person who's been diagnosed with acute anxiety disorder and obsessive compulsive disorder. And in addition to that, I've also been diagnosed with 2 developmental disorders, which are dyspraxia and a sensory processing disorder. So it's a bit of a if the right don't get you, then the left one will kind of situation, which is my Tinder bio. So my particular cocktail of inner hindrances manifest themselves in one way that is particularly noticeable for me, and I do think that they are all at least partially to blame. And that way is this. It's whenever I do anything or make a decision with any kind of consequences, my brain goes, how is this going to ruin your life irreparably? And then my brain finds an answer, and I believe that answer blindly. So whenever I write, say, an article that upsets somebody, as sometimes happens in my line of work, my brain is insistent, and I mean that, insistent, that that person will find me and kill me. And I mean literally kill me, I mean murder me, I mean this has happened before, like I've upset people and I've thought, this is my life over. Like that paranoia is so real and so dumb, but so real, and I believe it like I believe my hand is in front of my face right now. Like it's a dead cert. It's not a worry, it's a belief. And this built to a crescendo last summer when I became convinced I had colon cancer. Now, I visited 3 doctors, each of which told me the same 3 things. And that was that I had no family history of the disease, that 95% of cases of colon cancer occur in people over 40, and I had no symptoms. And unfortunately, early stage colon cancer is symptomless, which I believed only strengthened my argument, but not so much. So it was that insistence with which I pursued that whole fiasco, demanding colonoscopies and scans and all sorts of stuff like that, that led to a doctor diagnosing me. But he didn't diagnose me with cancer, he diagnosed me with obsessive compulsive disorder. And the way that works is the bad thoughts just get stuck in repeat on my head, like in my head. Unassailable, unshakable. I dogmatically believe that the worst thing possible will happen at all times. I'm like an evangelist for Murphy's Law. For a long time, I thought I could chalk that up to being a Liverpool fan. But the more I think about it, I guess, the more it sounds like OCD. So I think if mental illness were comparable to a food, it would be like Bertie Bott's Every Flavour Beans from Harry Potter. Now, for those of you who spent your childhood with friends instead of books, those are a magical kind of food, and no 2 of them taste the same. I think that no 2 mental illnesses present identically in the same people, or in 2 different people. But a common pattern with anxiety and other mental illnesses, though, is that as much as we like to believe it, it's not like a puzzle you can solve. It's not like a game of Tetris where you mess around for a while, wait for the long one to come down, and then bam, Tetris. It's more like Snake on the Nokia 3310. It's like this force that's just shambling around, looking for the next thing to sink its teeth into, and growing until eventually it drives you into a wall or into yourself. And that's me. And people like me need help sometimes. And people much worse off than me need more help more of the time. And people worse off than them need even more help. And there are people like that everywhere. So I believe it is a time for action. It's a time for change. And I think that the first change we it's not a budgetary change or a legislative change, it's an attitudinal change. We need to change our attitude towards mental health, the way we think about it and the way we talk about it. Because I think the way we discuss mental health and the way we don't discuss mental health is central to the whole conundrum. So, do you know how I know that there's an enormous disparity between the way we talk about mental health and the way we talk about physical health? It's this. If you go into a hospital with a broken leg, you are not going to leave that hospital until your doctors are satisfied that your injury has been treated and you are on course for recovery. Kat kind of spoke about this with her brother. The last people to see him alive were doctors who proclaimed that he wasn't a threat to himself. It beggars belief. If you've got a broken leg, the doctors don't send you out the door with a leg that will buckle again in 6 months' time. They don't send you out without being as sure as they can that they have done everything they can for you. And that analogy isn't supposed to suggest that when you're suffering from mental health problems that you're kept in hospital until you're better. It's supposed to suggest that, like with a broken leg, our country should have services and professionals and resources in place to immediately come up with a treatment plan that fits your needs. So everybody is taught from childhood, like, oh, you've got a sick stomach, you go to the doctor. And where's the doctor? Maybe 15 or 20 minutes away. Or if it's more serious, you go to a hospital. And where's the hospital? Maybe an hour away, maybe 2 hours away. Or if it's an emergency, you call an ambulance. That's ingrained, and it's a comprehensive plan for what happens when you get sick from the age of like 3 or 4. But we don't have that for mental health. If we see a fire, we call the fire brigade. If somebody perpetrates a crime against us, we'll call the police. If we see somebody get hit by a car, we're going to call them an ambulance. But what about when it's 3 a.m. and you have really and truly lost sight of what it is you're still alive for, and you have utterly forgotten what it means to be happy? Who do you call then? Maybe if you can think clearly enough, you'll call your best friend, or you'll call your mother, or you'll call Samaritans. But maybe you won't be thinking clearly enough, or maybe there's nobody for you to call. 10 people a week decide there's nobody left to call. It's 500 a year. And their phone is going to go to voicemail for the rest of everybody else's life. 10 people a week is a lot. It's more than 3 times the amount of people who die on Irish roads each year. And there are good reasons that reportage around suicide is the way it is. But if awareness is so reduced, are we really ever going to be angry enough that we take this issue to the top of the national debate and the national agenda? People who are suffering from mental illness are often fenced in by the attitudes of their peers. It would be short-sighted to speak as if there's just one kind of attitude that undermines progress on this front. The reality is that after centuries of having a very poor medical and scientific understanding of mental health, we've sort of become mired in a situation where now science of mental health has far outpaced the attitudes of way too many people. So, this week, after this event was announced, I noticed like a new kind of problematic attitude creeping into the discussion on mental health. We're all familiar with the classic attitude that mental health problems aren't real problems. But those are so outdated, I don't even want to address them. I want to talk about something Brezzy actually touched on as well, and it's people who are trying to police the discussion on mental health. People who think that when people like me get on stage to talk about mental health, we're talking about it in the wrong way. And that's a problem of language, and it's a breakdown of communication. There are those who think there are ways to talk about mental illness that are more or less valid than one another, which almost makes sense because mental health gets so little airtime in Ireland that everybody is kind of fighting to hog the spotlight when it does, as it so rarely does, comes up. So to return to the broken leg analogy, some people will suffer from a broken leg. Other people will twist their ankle. Some people will suffer a dead leg for an hour. Are these things all as existentially threatening? No. But is all the pain equally as valid? Yes. And should all these people know exactly the right course of action to help them deal with their pain? Yes. We can't talk about mental health like it's one monolithic disease. It's a mosaic. It affects every single person differently, and every single person has the same right to treatment. Just like the guy who has a common cold deserves cough syrup, and someone who's got cancer needs chemotherapy. We need a health service that provides immediate and effective healthcare for those suffering from mental illness. We do not need to argue over whose mental illness is more serious. We need to make sure that everybody can be helped in the appropriate manner, no matter how serious their illness. So I noticed this strange parallel in the media recently between this totally separate situation and mental illness in Ireland and how it's treated by the government. I was watching the documentary about Hillsborough on the BBC, the Hillsborough disaster that happened in 1989. And the facts are astounding. It's 96 people dead, failed and then subsequently blamed by the institutions that are supposed to keep them safe. And a government that refused to acknowledge the real reason why all these people had died, and refused to even pursue an explanation for that for years and years and years. Which, when I think about how epidemic suicide is in Ireland, it sounds very familiar to me. A turning point in the Hillsborough family search for justice came about 5 years ago when an MP from Liverpool named Andy Burnham went to speak at a Hillsborough memorial service in Anfield. And he was there to pass on the condolences of Parliament and to tell the families present that their dead won't be forgotten. He was there on behalf of his government to try and talk his way out of that issue. And just think how much easier his life would have been and his job would have been if the families who had lost mothers and sisters and husbands and brothers and fathers and children were happy just with condolences. No solutions, no answers, just condolences. But while Andy Burnham was trying to give his condolences, the crowd, the entire capacity of Anfield Stadium, interrupted him and started to chant justice for the 96, for those 96 people who had died. And they wouldn't stop. And he knew they wouldn't stop. And he was faced with the sorrow and the rage of 40,000 people all campaigning for justice for these people who had died with no explanation, no accountability, no recourse for justice at all. And you could see his face change on screen. Like, you can see him well up, and you can see nearly the moment he decides that he's not even going to try to get the crowd back on side, because there's no hope of it. Because he's realised that talk is cheap when it comes to matters of life and death. And he's staring down that barrel, and I think that's the barrel we need to aim at our government ministers now. So Andy Burnham went back to Parliament, and I don't know what he told them, but 2 years after that, a proper inquest into Hillsborough was set up, and 2 years on from that, the families of those 96 people now have as much justice as they could possibly have 27 years after the fact. So Simon Harris and Enda Kenny and Leo Varadkar, Ireland needs you to have that moment now. Ireland cannot wait another day. Thanks for listening.